we're back. Hello.
Hello.
Hello,
Hello.
Kirit.
Hey, Darko. Hey, Kyle. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Hey,
Welcome,
Kurt,
welcome,
thanks for
Kirit.
joining.
Yeah.
Super happy to have you here. Really looking forward to what you're going to be showing us. I hear that you also have another demo. So a lot of people were asking for demos at the beginning of the stream, and
Right.
Kirit's here to deliver another one.
Here are the demos, people, right? So, Kirit, who are you? What are you doing here? Sorry. Who are you? What do you do? And where do you join us from?
Yeah, I'm a machine learning solution architect, part of the SageMaker team, and I
Right.
focus heavily on machine learning operations. So that's SageMaker pipelines and effectively dealing with how machine learning can work at scale. So how do you take experiments that you're doing in a research setting or a lab setting, from going and trying
Okay.
out different types of models to then having that actually work at scale, and how do you support those operations so that your machine learning workflows are robust.
Gotcha.
So that's what I'm here to talk about today, and excited to share that with you.
Excellent. So, one of the things that Julia mentioned initially is that when you do machine learning, you actually have to experiment a lot, right? So it's not just like, oh, I made it work and it just works. You have to try, fail, repeat, try something new. So, what are you going to talk to us about that kind of helps us in the constant repetition, constant feedback loops, constant deploying of things? Wink, wink. Tell us about pipelines or whatever you're going to tell us about.
No, you're exactly right. If you're new to machine learning, or if you've been in machine learning for a while, that experimental nature of it, you can't escape that. You're going to try different ways of bringing in your data, different ways of preparing your data, then different model types for each different model, different parameters.
Mm-hmm.
Then when it comes to deployment, just like we saw earlier, there are different ways of deploying your model. And with each of those things, it's a whole bunch of trial and error until you get that perfect fit for your use case. And
Right.
now you can imagine, as we've seen in the previous demos, it's great to step through a notebook and try different methods to see what's working, so you can see your results in place. But if you needed to do that all the time, that's a lot of steps that
Yeah.
that you're going to need to keep running. And there may be instances where you want all of these steps to run automatically, and you just change the data, and you don't want to have to be there and go in and click through each cell in your notebook. And that's where pipelines comes into play. And that's where you can chain together a whole bunch of steps and then just say, hey, you know what? Run the pipeline. And then the pipeline will run all of those steps. And then you can just see your result right at the end. Maybe you're happy with the result, maybe you're not. If you're not happy, you can make some minor tweaks. And then again, run that pipeline where all of the components will run one after the other. So it's a great way to orchestrate and automate your machine learning workflows.
So,
Got it.
Kirit, I said this a couple of times before. I'm a mobile developer. That's like my background. And just to make sure that I'm actually understanding this right, I don't have a huge background in machine learning, but when you say pipelines and based off of what you just described, it kind of sounds very similar to the CI/CD process that I might have, when I'm deploying my app,
Yeah.
where there's several steps that I want to go through in regards to testing the app, making sure that everything passes, and then based off of that outcome, I can make some other final decision or send it continuing through that pipeline. They call them pipelines there too. So is that like kind of similar?
Exactly. It's very similar. So in a traditional CI/CD landscape, like you mentioned, mobile development, you have a set of steps, like maybe it's building your application, testing your application, and then deploying your application. With SageMaker pipelines, and in general with machine learning, the type of steps are different, right? The
Right.
steps are data preparation, the steps are model training, the steps are model deployment. And those are the steps that you can automate using SageMaker pipelines. In addition, you can bring that into a larger CI/CD workflow. So now if you're in the example of mobile development, let's say you're building an app and the app is using a machine learning model to do some predictions in the app. Now you need to not only build the mobile application, but you need to build the model. You need to deploy the application, and you need to deploy the model as well into
Right.
that application. So all this pipelining helps automate that entire process, where you have SageMaker pipelines that focuses on the machine learning aspect, and then you have larger CI/CD pipelines that can take care of the overall application deployment. So the two work hand in hand.
And in those pipelines, there's like, when we talk about CI/CD, there's usually a lot of testing phases in the pipelines. Is that a thing in machine learning? Do you actually test your changes as you go along?
Yeah. So when you are done training a pipeline, typically, as the developer that's training this pipeline, you'll have some criteria in mind that you want your model to perform against.
Right.
And it may be certain accuracy. You may want errors to be below a certain threshold. And when building out a pipeline, you can define steps in your pipeline to test a model against the metrics that you've
Okay.
defined. So you could have, a step for data preparation, a step for model training, and then a step for model evaluation. And then based on that model evaluation, you can then choose what happens afterwards, whether you need to retrain, whether it's okay to deploy. So you can bake in that testing as well.
Okay. Excellent.
Now that's starting to make sense to me. So I'm definitely interested to see what you have to show us today.
Exactly. So that's what's the whole point. Let's actually look at the demo, because we like looking at consoles. So I'm gonna bring it up on screen right now. So
awesome. So this is the SageMaker Studio UI. So we've seen this a couple of times so far. And what I'm specifically going to demonstrate today is two capabilities within SageMaker pipelines that increases the extensibility and flexibility with which you can define your pipelines. So when we launched SageMaker pipelines in reInvent 2020, you were able to orchestrate machine learning jobs on SageMaker so that you can prepare your data, train your model, all in SageMaker. And we wanted to offer customers even more flexibility when it comes to machine learning, because we understand that machine learning workflows can be complex. And given the vast ecosystem and services that AWS has, we wanted a way for users to then leverage services and features outside of SageMaker as well when building out these SageMaker pipelines. So two features that we launched are native support for invoking Lambda functions as a part of your SageMaker pipeline, and also support for invoking any function outside of SageMaker through a callback step in your SageMaker pipeline. And these are two features that I'm going to demonstrate today in these notebooks. And again, both these notebooks are available on GitHub. So I'm going to walk through the core parts of these notebooks.
Okay.
And explain to you the overall structure. And then I would encourage everyone to take a look at these notebooks, play around with them, and try building pipelines of your own. So in this first notebook, the pipeline that we've defined has a set of steps to prepare some data. So it takes some data from S3, does some data preparation. It trains a model. After the model has been trained, it evaluates the model and then adds the model to SageMaker's model registry. So that's SageMaker's model catalog, where you can have all your models stored so that you can manage your models more effectively. And then finally, it uses a Lambda function to deploy the model to a SageMaker endpoint. So the steps are data prep, training, and then deployment. And the deployment happens using a Lambda function. So in this notebook, I'm going to skip over to the specific Lambda step-related code. What's happening before this is some basic setup, IAM roles, so that your SageMaker pipeline can talk to the Lambda function. But the core thing that's happening here is we've defined a Lambda step. So this is a step in the pipeline that's going to call a Lambda function. So here we even define the Lambda function. And part of this release was also the capability for you to create your own Lambda functions in this notebook itself. So I don't have to leave my notebook. I'm in the notebook, and here I've defined code. And this code is going to be used to create a Lambda function. And then once I create this step and add it to my pipeline, the SageMaker pipeline, when it runs, will invoke this Lambda function. And then that invocation will result in a SageMaker endpoint being created. Now, in this function, I've defined certain inputs. So here I'm providing the model name, a name for my endpoint config, a name for the endpoint, and any other information I want to provide to the Lambda function. I define a set of outputs. So these are all the outputs that my Lambda function is returning to me. I'm able to capture that in the pipeline so that I can use it in other steps if I want to. And then once I've defined all the steps, I define my SageMaker pipeline by simply chaining together all of the steps that I have. So I have a processing step, I have a training step, and I have other steps in there that together combine and form my SageMaker pipeline. And when I'm ready, I can create the pipeline and I can execute it. And when I execute the pipeline, I can see that pipeline execution as a graph, again, on SageMaker Studio. So I've not left the SageMaker Studio IDE, and I've been able to define that pipeline, and I'm also able to view the execution of that pipeline. So in this graph, I can see all of the steps that my pipeline is running. I can see the last step over here is the Lambda step. I can see how the pipeline has the capability to branch out and run steps in parallel as well. If I have steps that are not dependent on each other and don't need to run in sequence, the pipeline will run them in parallel. And furthermore, I can click on each of these steps and I can see the inputs to those steps. I can see the outputs from those steps, and I can see other information related to those steps. So this also makes debugging really easy, because now let's say one of the steps in my pipeline had failed. I can click on the steps, I can look at the inputs, I can look at the outputs, I can look at the logs, and then I could see any errors that are showing up, and that'll help me quickly go in and debug this pipeline and help figure out why the step has failed, and then I can rerun my pipeline. So coming back to that automation piece, let's say that I had a step in the middle of my pipeline that failed. Now, if I go in and correct the step, I just need to rerun my pipeline, and all the steps before and after will run automatically for me. So if I have a 10-step process and step 8 fails, I don't have to go back in and run steps 1 through 8 to see how everything works together. I can just run the pipeline, go make a coffee, come back, and then I can see everything that's happening, and I don't have to be there to make that happen. So that's one of the main benefits you get with this kind of workflow orchestration and automation.
So just to clarify, this graph right here is representing one pipeline?
That's right. It's representing the pipeline that we just defined in this notebook that had the specific Lambda function that's being invoked. So that's the pipeline you can see in this UI.
And I can add and remove, I see little arrows at the bottom on the left. Is that zooming in and zooming out? And then I could zoom in and select one of these specific steps and then debug them if there's an error or something like that?
Yeah, so here I'm able to just zoom in, and then I can go click on any step. And when I click on the step, that's where I can see more detailed information about the step. I can see the logs, and then this will give me hints as to why a particular step has failed, if it did. And then using that, I can go back into the code and make those corrections so that the next time I run the pipeline, I don't see that failure.
I'll tell you right now, me being new to this entire process, just knowing that there's a GUI as part of some of this, it makes me feel a little bit more comfortable.
and what's fascinating here is that you actually create all of this through Python. When I thought about a pipeline, I thought it's you create a pipeline externally from SageMaker, but it's actually you do it exclusively through a Jupyter Notebook, right?
Yes, absolutely. So the SageMaker SDK is what you use to create this entire pipeline. So all of these steps that you see here, these are Python classes that are made available in the SageMaker SDK. So in a very familiar Pythonic interface, you're able to define your overall pipeline.
So just kind of stepping out of here a bit, SageMaker for me is it looks like Emacs. SageMaker is not just an IDE. SageMaker is not just a piece of software here. It's everything. It does all of the stuff for you. So I love that. It has its own SDK. So wow.
Yeah, like you mentioned earlier, it's both the entry point and the exit point for machine learning. And with this, you can now even operate it at scale.
I love that. Excellent. Cool. So now, how does the execution look like? Now, how would you kick off an execution?
Right. So a couple of ways you can do that. Either here in the SDK, I can create the pipeline definition. So here I can actually look at all the steps in the pipeline and the inputs and outputs. And then once that's done, it's as simple as a pipeline.start.
Okay, good.
So using a pipeline.start, my pipeline will trigger, and then I would be able to see the UI, and then that would be running. Another way of doing this is I can actually go into the UI, click on the pipeline,
Right.
and I can start an execution.
Oh,
so
excellent.
this execution that you see here, the one that succeeded, is the one that we're looking at over here.
Right. Excellent.
Now I can start this and I can see more executions in the same UI.
Gotcha. Now we have a question here. Kind of, it's outside of pipelines, but maybe we can address this. A question from Zara. Zara asks. Let me just move myself underneath. Okay, so we can see Anne. Fairly new to SageMaker. Curious about the following: when do we load the data into SageMaker Story? Does the notebook keep a cache of it like they do in Jupyter Notebooks? Is that the case, or is the data somewhere in S3? Right, in this case.
So you would typically have your data in S3, especially when you're dealing with large volumes of data, and you're training models on gigabytes of data. Then you would have that data in S3, and then you would configure your SageMaker training job to load that data into the training job as that is executing.
Right.
Alternatively, if you're dealing with smaller chunks of data and you want to do some data exploration in your SageMaker notebook and play around with it in Python, you can upload small samples of data into this Jupyter environment and play around with it in your notebook.
Okay, gotcha. And just to quickly answer this, and Tessa is asking, can you govern these with AWS developer tools like Code Pipeline, Code Commit? My thought on this is that no, these are separate pipeline tools. They're part of the SageMaker Studio, and Kirit, correct me if I'm wrong, right? That is the case in here.
So SageMaker Pipelines is meant for orchestrating your machine learning work. Cool. Now, if you were doing this as a part of a larger CI/CD process where you were using something like Code Pipeline to build an application, do some other steps, and a part of that process, you wanted to go and train a model in this automated way, you could have Code Pipeline start the execution of a SageMaker pipeline if you wanted to. And we have actually this feature called SageMaker Projects, which offers you templates. And those templates are a quick way to get started with using SageMaker pipelines and having that orchestrated by CI/CD tools like Code Pipeline, where you would have your code in a code commit or GitHub or Bitbucket, and you could have tools like Code Pipeline or Jenkins, pull the code, build the code, run your SageMaker pipeline, and then handle that whole end-to-end process.
Right. Excellent.
So, Kirit, I had a personal question that I was curious about. Like I said, I'm new to all of this, and what I would most likely do is I would try to tackle like one piece of SageMaker at a time and figure out how to get that process to work. So then, like, let's say that I build out these different pieces that make up an entire pipeline, and now I have these existing SageMaker pieces. Like, how easy or hard would it be in order to like incorporate those into something like a pipeline?
Yeah, great question. And the answer is it would be fairly simple, because you would be doing all of this within the same SDK and in the same environment. So let me show you an example. So if I look through this code over here, and this is where I've defined the training step in my pipeline. And now let's say you were working on these individual components, testing them out, trying them out, waiting until you got the perfect fit. You would be creating SageMaker processing jobs. You would be creating SageMaker training jobs. You would be creating SageMaker estimators, setting your hyperparameters, and running those jobs until you're happy with what you saw. Now, when defining a pipeline step, I'm doing all the same things where I'm defining my SageMaker estimator. I would do this independent of whether I was using a pipeline. I'm setting my hyperparameters on that estimator. And then the only piece that's different and that is unique to the pipeline is, instead of running the training job in the notebook, you would wrap that into a training step. So this is the pipeline training step. So I would just provide the training step with my SageMaker estimator with the inputs for training, and then that's all I would need to merge that into the pipelines context and then orchestrate that as a pipeline. So when you're working within SageMaker and you're creating these SageMaker processing jobs and training jobs, porting that over to a pipeline is a fairly straightforward process.
Got it. Okay. That sounds good.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. So what else do you have to show us? Are we done?
No. So the other thing that I want to show you is the SageMaker callback step. And now in the previous example, we looked at how do you extend a SageMaker pipeline beyond just SageMaker native jobs and use Lambda functions. Now here, we're going to go one step further and say, how do I extend my SageMaker pipeline, not only beyond SageMaker jobs, but to any kind of job in AWS? And you can do that using a callback step. So here in this example, I have a pipeline that is doing data preparation using AWS Glue. So I'm invoking an AWS Glue job to do some data preparation, and then using that data to train my model in SageMaker, and then to deploy that model for batch transformation or for batch inference. And that whole set of steps is orchestrated by SageMaker pipelines. And the way this works is we have a callback, which you send from your SageMaker pipeline a unique token and a set of inputs to an SQS queue. And then from that SQS queue, you can then invoke any other process you want. So in this example, we use the SQS queue to invoke an AWS Glue job for data preparation. And we use a Lambda function and an ECS Fargate task to orchestrate that piece. And then at the end of that, the Glue job will store its data in S3. And the Fargate task will send this message back to the pipeline saying that the pipeline, that step was a success. So effectively, you can think of it as you're running your pipeline. When you reach that callback step, you send a message to SQS saying, hey, now I'm leaving SageMaker pipelines and I need you to go run some job and tell me when you're done. SQS will then lead to other functions being triggered, in this case, Lambda function to ECS to Glue. And then SageMaker pipelines will wait until it sees a message that's come back to it with this same token and this status saying that the step has succeeded. And once it sees that, then it knows to go to the next steps of the SageMaker pipeline. So with this now, you have the flexibility to extend your pipelines to anything in the AWS ecosystem. So if that's Glue, you can do it based on this notebook. If you want to run an EMR job, you can invoke an EMR job through your pipeline, and you have all that flexibility.
I mean, in essence, you can just kick off step functions, right, and do anything with that, right? So would that be possible? Could you trigger a step functions in this case? I think you can.
You could trigger anything. You could do anything with the custom callback, as it's on you as the implementer of this to then define what happens when this SQS queue receives this message.
Wonderful, wonderful. I think that's a really great option. And we have seen Franklin asking here, so you can also use EventBridge. Basically, anything that has an API, you can trigger it in this case. So it is quite wonderful, right? And in configuring this, is there any additional steps you need to do? I'm not sure if you're going to show us how you configure this specific pipeline, but is there anything more complex on this one?
Yeah. So when using the callback, there's some other infrastructure that you need to set up beyond just the pipeline. So in the Lambda step, we had the Lambda function that was created as part of the pipeline, right? So we used a Python function, created a Lambda function, and that was invoked by the SageMaker pipeline. In this case, you need to create the SQS queue. And then you could have a single queue that's used across all your pipelines, so that you have one queue that you send your pipeline messages to, and then that queue can be used to handle any other downstream process. For this notebook, because we're invoking a Glue job, the other pieces of infrastructure that's set up is this Lambda function to handle the inbound messages in this queue, an ECS task that's used to start the Glue job and then send this message back to the pipeline, and the Glue job itself.
Right.
So this infrastructure needs to be set up, and this notebook walks through all of those steps, including setting up all the IAM roles and policies that you need so that your pipeline can talk to SQS, and then each of the other services can talk to each other, and then send messages back to the pipeline. But again, this portion is completely governed by you as the user.
Yes.
The only thing that's required is this SQSQ, because that's what the pipeline will talk to, and that's what then starts the rest of the process. So this piece of infrastructure is needed, and this is dependent on the use case.
Here's a question for you right now. In the execution of the pipeline, can the pipeline actually call an AWS API? Like just using the Python SDK, both the three. Can it do like something like that? Is it possible the pipeline execution does that?
So you have multiple ways in which you can do that. So with SageMaker pipelines, you have processing jobs that you can call SageMaker native processing jobs. Within a processing job, you can use the Boto 3 API to do anything you want using that API. So that's one option. Another option is you can use a pipeline to invoke a Lambda function and have the Lambda function use the Boto 3 API to then invoke anything else. You can also use this callback. So you have multiple ways in which you can leverage those APIs, but a simple processing job would also work.
In my head is this like, oh, can I use the pipeline to actually create these other elements to do things for me? But in essence, yes, I can, right? I can trigger a Lambda function that will create an SQSQ for me and return back the ARN or whatnot, and kind of not have it pre-provisioned before it kicks off. But that's just
You have the flexibility to do all these things. Again, depends on your use case and the type of experience you want to enable.
Wonderful, excellent. Cool.
Yeah. So then I won't run through this entire notebook. A lot of this is the setup for the various resources and IAM. And once again, I encourage all of you to take a look at this notebook on GitHub. Yeah. I'll just run down to the specific callback step so you can see the simple API for that. So here, this is the callback step where I define any outputs that the callback needs to provide. In this case, it's the output data path, so the path that Glue is writing the prepared data to. And I provide the URL to the SQS queue. So this is how the callback step knows which queue to send a message to, what inputs to send as part of that message, and then where to provide the output. So with this simple step, you're now able to invoke your other jobs from the SageMaker pipeline. And similar to what we saw earlier, you'll see that execution in the UI again. So I can see here that the first step is the Glue callback, and then I'm training a model, creating a model, and I'm doing batch transformation.
Excellent, wonderful. I again love the visuals, love the fact that you can do all of this from SageMaker directly from a Jupyter notebook. So excellent. So if you have needs to do something with your code, do something with your machine learning algorithms and models and all of those things, and you need to keep on repeating yourself, SageMaker pipelines are definitely the solution for you. And if you also want to do something more beyond SageMaker, SageMaker pipelines with callback functions are definitely the solution for you as well. So, Kirit, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You all can find the links to all of this in the chat. I believe somebody will be posting. We have a lot of folks in chat, so if you can, please do post a link to the GitHub page or to a blog post or whatever we have here, so people can see that. So thank you very much, Kirit. Once again, thank you very much for being part of today's AWS on Air. We learned.
Yeah, really. Thank you for breaking that down for us. I love the whole automation thing. So thank you.
Indeed.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirit. Thank you very, very much, and have a lovely day.
Thanks.
I'm sorry, Kirit, for cutting you off, but thank you. Kyle, so we've seen a lot of machine learning today, and neither you or I are experts in machine learning, but
nope. But I definitely feel like I learned so much in this session. Like having gone in and not really even knowing much about SageMaker, and then like having Julia explain it, then getting the basic breakdown of like Studio with Samita, and then Taryn talking about asynchronous, and now just Curate going over the whole entire pipeline process. Like,
Indeed.
I feel like a hackathon. I feel
Yeah.
like in a hackathon type of mode right now.
Indeed,
I want to
indeed.
build something.
Yeah, and chat, please do let us know. Let us know if you're planning to build something with SageMaker. Again, there's a free tier available for you. You can check it out. There's been a lot of blog posts shared throughout the day, so you can check all of those things out as well. And I think SageMaker is one of the services that has a lot of content, a lot of documentation out there. We talked about the wonderful book on database on Amazon SageMaker by Jeff's infomercial. So make sure to check out the book by Julian. Check out all the blog on all the links here. And if you're at the end of the show, don't worry. This show is also going to be available on Twitch, twitch.tv/AWS/videos. You can find this show and all the other shows there as well. So excellent. I would like to thank all of our ASL interpreters, Meadow and Anne. Thank you very much. Kyle, thank you very much for being part of the show.
Hey, it's always a pleasure to hang out with you, Darko, and learn
Absolutely.
something new. Can't pass it up.
Absolutely. And thank you to all the guests. It's been fun. And to everybody else, have a wonderful weekend. Rest up and check out.